Good morning, St. Mark's. You may be seated. A lot of power up here. I like it. When Anne-Marie asked if I wanted to preach on MLK Sunday, I said yes before I'd even finished reading the email. What an honor to have the opportunity to reflect on Dr. King's life and legacy, and at the same time attempt to do what Anne-Marie and Paul and others do for each of us each week. Share some thoughts that might situate the message of the gospel and remind us that we're called to endeavor to be like Jesus in the context of today's crazy world. So I sat down to write, the Bible in one hand and the New York Times in the other. Like Paul had shared a few weeks ago, is best practice for Episcopal priests and DEI practitioners playing priest for the day, like me. And something occurred to me as I flipped through this week's headlines. What if Anne-Marie hadn't asked me to preach today because in her buttering me up email, I am a voice of wisdom at St. Mark's? But what if she'd actually asked me to preach because this past week and the one to come feels so dark that even she wanted to pawn this message of love and hope off to somebody else for the week? I don't actually think you did that, but if you did, I get it, because this was very hard. Now, what we heard from Dr. King this morning and today's gospel reading provide us with a bit of a compass to help us navigate this uncertain time. So our service started, for those of you who were late, with Dr. King sharing an encounter with God at his kitchen table in Montgomery, Alabama. Thank God for YouTube, that all these years later, we're able to hear Dr. King tell this beautiful story in his own beautiful voice. I'd never heard it before, so in preparation, I went digging for more context around this divine encounter. The story goes that he was awakened around midnight by a phone call. It was January 1956, a few weeks after Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on the bus, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott and thrusting King, reluctantly, into the spotlight as a civil rights leader and an agitator of the white supremacist culture and community in which he lived. The person on the other end of the phone that night threatened him and his family. Leave here in 3 days or I'll kill you and I'll blow up your home. This wasn't the first phone call like this that Dr. King had received in the weeks since the bus boycott began and the financial impact to his white neighbors began to show. But for some reason, this particular call shattered Dr. King's nerves and sent him spiraling. What if they hurt me? What if they hurt Coretta? What if they hurt my tiny baby girl, Yolanda? She was only 7 weeks old then. His spin continued. Who can I call upon to help me? I'm far away from my family. I can't call my mother. I can't call my father. What philosophy or theology could possibly help steady me when my life could be over, literally or figuratively, and I have no control over it? All of us have been where Dr. King was that night at some point in their lives, and I feel a bit of that right now. As we sit here on the eve of Trump's second inauguration, fires still ravaging my hometown of Los Angeles, having displaced or unhoused 150,000 people at last count, the threat of mass deportation of our undocumented brothers and sisters looming, wars raging around the world, leaving behind unimaginable destruction. Many of us, like Dr. King in that desperate moment, yearn for our world to be rescued from what can feel like a living nightmare. And we may even be feeling like the worldly help that we were hoping for may not come. And in that moment of immense fear and pain and desperation that Dr. King was feeling in the kitchen that night, he could only think of one thing left to do. He called out for God. He placed his trust in God's power to make a way out of no way. And when he called, God answered. Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the earth. Those who'd threatened Dr. King and his family that night on the phone kept their promise, and 3 days later, they bombed Dr. King's house. His family escaped without being harmed, and King later wrote in his book, Stride Toward Freedom, I accepted the word of the bombing calmly. My religious experience a few nights before had given me the strength to face it. Upon hearing news of the bombing, a crowd of King's neighbors came to his defense. They were ready to exact vengeance on those who'd attempted to take his life. But King told the crowd, we must meet hate with love. Remember, if I am stopped, this movement will not stop because God is with this movement. Go home with this glorious faith and radiant assurance. Dr. King's faith had dissipated his fear and made real a national, nonviolent movement that would bend the arc of history toward justice. Today's gospel reading offers us another example of how faith can make things real. When the wine ran out at the wedding in Cana of Galilee, the servants responsible for refilling the wine were instructed to do 3 things. 1, do whatever Jesus tells you. 2, fill the stone jars with water. And 3, take those jars to the chief steward. I am certain that as they were doing as they were told, the servants were both skeptical and stressed. This cannot possibly work. I'm doing something crazy. No one can turn water into wine. And then I imagine their shock and their awe as they witnessed a miracle, that water had turned into wine. And even further, that they had contributed to that. This was Jesus' first sign, the first time he made a way out of no way, proving to his disciples that with faith in him, anything was possible. So that message was clear. Listen to Jesus, take the actions he asks of you, and together, you can make a miracle. That's how Dr. King lived too. We often look to him as a brilliant coalition builder who led in community with fellow activists, organizers, faith leaders, unions, legislators, and more. But what strikes me most about Dr. King is the way he was able to inspire everyday folk, people like you and me, into action. People who may not have considered themselves activists, but who were so moved by the pain of oppression and racism they experienced or they witnessed in their own lives, that Dr. King's message of justice and equal humanity galvanized them into action. They found themselves freedom riding on an interstate bus or marching on Washington for jobs and freedom. The everyday people involved in the civil rights movement who marched, boycotted, protested, sat in, strategized, prayed, may not have realized that they were filling stone jars with water en route to the miracle of the wine of freedom. And their collective actions, their individual gifts that they were bringing, like that reading shared with us earlier, were an explanation of their immense faith that this country can be completely different than it was, or that it ever had been. It could be more equitable. It could be more just. and the movement that Dr. King and his contemporaries, many of whom don't have a national holiday named after them, changed laws and changed lives, including mine. That's a miracle. Tomorrow, our nation will inaugurate a felon into the highest office in the land. But we'll also celebrate and honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The wildfires in LA will continue to rage, destroying acres of God's green earth, and God forbid could gobble up more people's homes and businesses. But the outpouring of generosity for the impacted communities, led by Angelenos and amplified by people around the world, feels fiercer than those fires. Wars rage all over the globe, decimating cities and tearing families apart and tearing communities apart. But after 15 long months, ceasefire between Israel and Hamas looks to be possible. Glory be to God. I once read that it takes faith to have faith, and I feel that strongly right now. Like Dr. King at the kitchen table, we must remember that even when things are looking grim and bleak and hopeless, that we are never alone. And God told Dr. King, and I'm reminding us as we step into this future, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even until the end of the earth. We have God, we have each other, and with enough faith, we'll make miracles. Amen.